welcome everyone to this joint event hosted by Cheeky Little Careers in collaboration with Sullivan and Cromwell. I'm Husnara, the owner and editor of Cheeky Little Careers, and I'm really excited to be joined by Ben Perry, who is a very long-term contact of mine and is an M&A partner and the training principal with the London office of S&C, which is short for Sullivan and Cromwell. We're also joined by Kirsten, who won't be participating in the interview, but Kirsten leads the graduate recruitment at S&C's London office, and she's on hand this evening to answer any questions regarding the S&C application process. Let me give you a really quick background summary on me, and then I'll get Ben to do the same. So for those of you who've not attended any previous events I've hosted, I was a lawyer. I trained and qualified with a magic circle firm called Linklaters, and much like Ben, I specialised in corporate for about 3 years before I switched careers to become a journalist, and I spent 10 years on the Lawyer magazine, including a spell as the city editor and then as the careers editor as well. And that's really when I got to know Ben, because I was writing about vac schemes and training contracts probably before you guys were all born. Anyway, so but Ben and I have been in the legal industry for many, many years now, and some of what we're going to be discussing will involve what's happened in the past, as well as sort of looking forward to the future. Anyway, my work now really comprises running my blog, Cheeky Little Careers, and also doing career coaching for qualified lawyers and trainee solicitors, as well as skills training. But really the focus this evening is on Ben. So let me hand over to him to quickly say hello and to say a few words about himself. Ben, how have you been? We've not spoken for a few weeks.
No, we haven't. Well, I had enjoyed a break over Christmas and New Year, but actually it has been very busy in terms of M&A activity and the transactions in which I've been involved and advising on, really sort of for several months, going back to the end of last summer and through through Christmas and through into the new year. You mentioned and thank you that for the reminder that I'd been doing this for quite a long time, and it used to be the case when I first started out. I remember clearly when I was a trainee and a junior associate that there was always a high amount of the work for the year seemed to be done in October, November, and December. Over the course of my career, I think that had largely evened out across the year, but actually this year it felt a bit like ones that I can remember from a long time ago, where it was was very busy, but fortunately we were able to the transactions on which we were working were successfully concluded and announced, and we're now moving forward to close those deals and start work on other ones.
So what have you been working on recently that's in the public domain? What can you share with us?
There's probably one sort of very significant transaction in terms of the value, and this was announced in December, which was our firm's client, which is a US biopharmaceutical company called Amgen, which is based in California on the West Coast, has announced the acquisition of an interesting company that actually is incorporated in Ireland, but its business operations are largely in the US, called Horizon. And so that deal announced a couple of weeks before Christmas, and is now moving forward, and that was a very significant transaction in terms of in terms of value, and it was a great one to be involved in for myself and for the team, the quite large team here who worked on a lot of different aspects of the transaction, not just M&A, but also financing, antitrust and foreign investment, intellectual property, employment and benefits, and so on. So it really was a great a great team and a great team effort.
And what would a trainee be doing on a deal like that?
Actually, would depend. There are many with a deal like that, and actually, it's one of the good things about a training contract is, you get to see, I was just speaking with someone before I came onto this call and talking about the difference between the UK system and the US system, and the fact that in the UK system, the training contract exposes you to different areas of practice, different areas of law, allows you to become a well-rounded lawyer, and then allows you to make an informed decision about what, how you see your career development and what areas you want to pursue. So in a deal like this, for example, you could be involved either on the M&A, or if you were doing a financing seat, you could be involved on the financing, or if you're doing an antitrust seat, you could be involved in the antitrust. And so actually, from a sort of trainee perspective, trainees were involved in each of those areas. So it could be a range of different things within any one transaction. And then over the course of your training contract, you get the opportunity to see a deal like that or another deal from a different angle. So you get to see how, for example, the M&A and the financing sides of the deal differ from one another, and what the different roles are that the lawyers play.
Sure. No, it sounds very, very fascinating, and as you say, a real sort of wealth of opportunities to get involved in. So thank you for that. Before I move on to my next question, just a couple of things I should have mentioned at the beginning. Obviously got carried away chatting to Ben, but if you have got a question for either Ben, myself, or for Kirsten, then you'll see at the bottom of your screens there's a Q&A function. So if you submit those, we can deal with them as we go along or at the end. I have got some questions in advance that I hope we will have time to cover off. But what I wanted to really sort of discuss with you this evening is, I don't tend to talk about politics because it can be a bit of a dangerous topic to raise, because people have different political views. But I think you and I share one view, which is, what on earth was Liz Truss trying to achieve with Kwasi Kwarteng last year, in fact, this idea of trickle-down economics. And any students watching who would have paid attention to the news at the time the mini budget was announced, the markets were in a state of turmoil. And students may well reference that in a forthcoming VaxGive interview, but just talking about it and mentioning it are two different things. What can you say about that, and how can students address that topic in a way that's more meaningful to law firms?
Okay. Well, I think it's a really great example of something that I've seen on a number of occasions over my career, which is how the macro picture, or sort of larger macroeconomic type factors, can actually have a direct impact on day-to-day activity of a transactional lawyer. And in those sort of brief few weeks, I think there are two particular things that stand out that, in my experience, had an immediate impact on what people were doing on sort of things that they were working on at the time. The first one, and this is it'd be an ongoing factor in the economy for sort of years to come, but really was the impact on interest rates. There was an immediate, short-term impact on, what the base rate of the central bank were, which in turn is how the rate that, companies and firms that are looking to borrow money to do things like acquisitions, how much that's going to cost them. And suddenly people, and this was all, I think what made it quite, made a greater impact was the fact that this was all happening suddenly and in real time, and it wasn't something that anybody had planned for or forecast. Large companies and large investment firms, they employ, top economists who've, studied PhDs at the great universities of the world to be able to forecast for them these sorts of things that were happening. The situation that you were describing was sort of so sudden that everybody was having to deal with the impact of it in real time. But the impact essentially was suddenly people were waking up and finding that it was going to be significantly more expensive to do the deal that they were working on, and they had to go and look at whether that deal was still affordable and sustainable in light of the additional costs. The second, and that also sort of would interplay into other aspects, which is, for example, there may be someone would be looking to buy a company that had borrowed, and that company was going to have to pay more interest. And in the past, people had looked at solutions like there's a thing called hedging, which is basically you hedge a risk. You take the risk of an interest rate going up and you transact with a counterparty who will instead give you a fixed rate of interest. Well, suddenly things like hedging were either very expensive or maybe not even available because the people on the other side of the hedges had no better idea what was going to happen next. And the second aspect was obviously the currency as well. And again, suddenly if people are, if you're a UK company trying to do a deal overseas and your income and your revenues are in sterling, you suddenly found that transaction overseas to be a lot more expensive because the pound was worth a lot less. At the same time, the pound being worth a lot less has made UK companies, and particularly UK listed companies, a lot more attractive to overseas acquirers as well. So, those two factors, when I look ahead to 2023, when you look at the macro picture, I'd say two of the most important things are interest rates and sort of currency rates, and that short period gives us an idea of just how big an impact they can have in a very short space of time.
Talking about the macroeconomic picture, let's talk about the R word, recession. I don't know whether we're technically in recession or not because they keep changing their minds, because we had this unexpected period of growth. So technically, I don't think we are in recession, but let's assume that we are, and the economic picture continues to remain uncertain. What does that mean for law firms? Because the legal sector is usually quite robust, isn't it, compared to other industries when it comes to economic downturns?
Yeah, I mean, I think any law firm actually, and as a transactional lawyer, you're looking at that question in a different way, which is you're saying, what does this mean for the clients, for the people that I'm working with, for the sectors that I'm operating in, and so to a few ways that, because actually how it affects the clients is ultimately how it's going to affect the work that we do. And in many ways, I think times of uncertainty and volatility are generally, and I've seen this over my career as well, they're good times for lawyers. It's a good time to be there, to be a port of call, because people need help and guidance. They may find themselves in tricky financial situations, for example. A good example of how something can be affected is, what about a consumer business that's facing increased costs in its supply chain? Is it going to be able to pass those costs over to customers? How is that company's capital structure set up? Is there a lot of debt? When is that debt coming due? How is the interest rate on that debt structured? Is the company going to have enough money to repay the interests? And you might look at a situation like that from a lot of different perspectives. We might be involved with the company. We might be involved with people who've bought the debt, who may even also see an opportunity to take control of a company in that situation if it was to breach the covenants in its financing, which would give the lenders rights to perhaps do things that they wouldn't otherwise be able to do. So that there's lots and lots of, in any situation, the good lawyers and the entrepreneurial lawyers are actually thinking, what does this mean for the people I'm working with, and where are the where are the opportunities? The other significant opportunity for lawyers in what's going on at the moment, and again, there's a lot written about this in the US, but there is a sort of broader global movement, is about regulators and enforcement activity. Any time that regulators become more assertive and wanting to put themselves out into the market, creates significant opportunities for lawyers who are who are expert in those areas. And luckily, I work at a firm where that expertise covers the US, Europe, and Asia. And that also affects, regulatory scrutiny can affect things like M&A transactions and how those get done and how long it takes them to get done as well. So those again are just two of the factors. The other one I would highlight, and this is not so much in terms of sort of for things like domestic mortgage lending, which is something that affects us as individuals day to day, but actually just the capital markets generally. Because again, looking back over my career, the thing that affects activity the most is it's the availability of money to do those transactions. And what I've seen in the past is in periods where there's been sort of either a significant shock to the system, so going back to something like a 9/11, or like the sort of 2008 financial crisis, or the euro crisis in 2011, there can be a significant shock that can sort of leads to kind of a structural inertia in the system, and that something like that may take a time to go through. I think one of the things we were seeing last year, is that there was a period where banks had been looking at sort of large transactions, but then towards the end of the year began to start lending again for those transactions. But that's probably the one factor that on its own can have the biggest impact, is just the availability of funding in the market for companies and investment firms to do the things that they're looking to do.
Thank you. That's really helpful. That connection between, money is what makes the world go around, and without that money, there are no, the deals might need to be reconsidered in terms of how they're structured, how they're funded, etc., etc. So really interesting. Thank you for that. And I guess from my perspective, I'm old enough to have been a journalist when Lehman collapsed, and as you highlighted already, that was called the credit crunch. It was caused by the credit crunch, i.e. the lack of money available, people over borrowing in the first instance, caused by the subprime crisis, for those of you who want to look that up. But this feels different, and I think there are going to be opportunities for law firms, and certainly for trainees or future trainees who feel spooked by what's going on. Another point worth noting is that law firms recruit trainees quite far in advance, so everything we're experiencing today may be confined to history by the time you start your training contracts. And law firms factor that in their recruitment cycle. Okay, let's talk a bit more about your work, if I may. You, as a firm, do advise on M&A deals, but both for privately owned businesses, so private companies, as well as public companies. How does the work and the advice you give those two different types of businesses differ if you were sort of the lawyer offering the advice?
In some ways, actually, the advice may be no different at all. It ultimately, what a good lawyer does is he or she, is adept at dealing with different situations and tailoring their advice to the client's objectives. Mm. So, ultimately in M&A, if you're advising a buyer, the buyer's objectives are normally sort of pretty similar, whoever the buyer may be. They want, you're protecting them against risk in terms of what they're buying. You're ensuring that they have appropriate protections if something goes wrong. A lot of what we do as lawyers is about identifying, addressing, and managing risk. And you're also focused on execution and deliverability. So making sure, I talked about regulatory scrutiny, making sure that you can help the client navigate through the regulatory process, and the transaction can be successfully consummated. Where I think sort of different types of clients, the biggest difference you see is often just as a day-to-day level in the personnel who you're dealing with. A large corporation will have sort of lots of layers of different people, and at the top of the corporation are the board of directors and the very senior management. And depending on the company, you may not sort of you don't sort of deal with public company CEOs even that much as a partner, let alone as a trainee or a junior lawyer. They're managing worldwide businesses. They have a lot of demands on their time. They tend, with a few exceptions, they tend not to get involved in the nitty-gritty of the negotiation of a contract. They say, well, we're paying people to do that, and so you'll work with a business, what some companies call business development, which is really an internal M&A function. You work with the internal legal function, you work with the other key stakeholders within the company, but there'll be lots of different constituencies. When you're working for a private equity firm, quite often, and I'm conscious of this as I get older, your clients will be a lot younger than you are when you get to my stage. You know, they're people who've taken a route through into careers in finance, often starting at an investment bank. Historically used to often be accountancy, so to gain that financial experience and literacy, and then they move into private equity firms, which are, you know, generally run as fairly you know, lean operations, but where the people going in are very talented and get a lot of responsibility. So it's you know, there will be a group of the senior people within the firm called the investment committee, who ultimately they will often be interrogating the people who are running the deal about why it's a good deal and so on. So you get a lot of questions, a lot of requests for input. You tend not to sort of see that process. You know that it's going on, and that the team prepares very, very heavily for it. But then actually in terms of executing it, you'll be getting a lot more sort of contact sometimes with people day to day, and they'll be ringing up a lot more with questions and requests. So it's really just, you know, like a lot of what we do, it comes down to being able to, you know, be good with people, deal with different personalities, and deal with different situations.
And PE deals are usually driven by different underlying factors to a deal between two public companies or private companies. Can you explain the difference, and just to help the students appreciate why a PE house might want to do a deal versus a company buying its competitor out?
Sure. Actually, I'm very happy to do that. There are actually a lot of I'm going to give a plug for some background reading on the world of private equity and private capital generally. A book that's written by someone who I worked with as he was a client for a number of years. The book is called 2 and 20 by Sachin Kajuria, and he explains it sort of more eloquently and in more detail than I could. But essentially, the private equity fund works. It brings in outside money from people like pension funds and insurance companies. Those investors pay the private equity fund a fee to manage the money, and the private equity fund also gets to keep a share of the profit. So whenever they're looking for an investment, they are very focused on value, what they're paying for it, and ultimately the ability to exit from that investment, which may mean selling the company, merging it with another company, or floating it on the stock market, and being able to do that within a realistic time frame. And they're also focused on the operational changes and enhancements that they can bring to the business, and they're able to add a lot of value by doing that. Quite often they're focused on companies that, you know, sometimes have been unloved, under-resourced in terms of time and attention as part of a larger group, and they've got a tremendously successful track record over, you know, the last 20 to 30 years of turning those companies around and selling them for a lot more than they paid for them, and, you know, the individuals becoming very successful as a result. You know, a corporate is looking, you know, at a transaction as part of its wider corporate strategy that maybe some of the reasons that corporates do M&A are things like expansions into new geographies, expansions into new product areas or lines, or even different lines of business. And often when they're deciding whether or not to sort of to go forward with a transaction, they're weighing, on the one hand, you know, the head start that they get by buying something, versus what it would cost, the time and effort and energy to start that from scratch themselves. But they're also weighing sort of the opportunities that can come from integration, as well as some of the drawbacks. You know, the time, you know, particularly with a big merger, the time that it just takes to integrate two companies. Just think about things like two companies with their different IT and email systems, and it can take months or years just to get everybody onto the same IT system for example, and it can be very expensive. So those are the kinds of things that they will be thinking thinking more about. There is also a sort of halfway house where what a lot of private equity firms have done in recent years is they've adopted what's called a buy and build strategy. So they'll buy a company that's operating in a particular sector, and then they will use that company to buy up other companies within that market. They'll create enhancements to value by creating a bigger business. And so again, they will be in those situations, and there's a term for them, it's called bolt-on acquisitions. They will be focused on the operational side, and how do I bring this business into my existing business, and how do I integrate them successfully and make the larger company a success. And there's also in history when M&A doesn't go well, and it's normally for two reasons: either because the buyer paid too much, it paid too much for something, the market the market turned against it, or it's because the integration wasn't wasn't a success when they did close the transaction.
So that's a really helpful explanation. Thank you for that. I'm sure the students really benefit from that. One follow-up question I did have is that at what point do lawyers get involved in these deals?
It can actually often be sort of very early on, right at the stage. I've spent a lot of time over my career often where people are even talking about a deal hypothetically, but sometimes they want and need to get sort of expert legal advice involved to understand what it would take and what the feasibility of doing that is. So you can sometimes be working on something, and I've done this in my career. There are some things that never went forward, and I can never tell anybody what it was, but I spent months or sometimes longer working on something that ultimately didn't proceed. Normally in a sort of normal acquisition, there's some sort of internal work done, if for no other reason than someone has to sign off on spending money on lawyers, and then you get a call. As a partner, the sort of first call is to ask if you're free to act, so to make sure you don't have a conflict of interest or aren't advising another party, and then you're up and running. So that could be at the very early stages where, for example, the client might not have any information. If it's a buyer, might not have any information, and it's your first task is to work on the non-disclosure agreement, which the business being sold wants to put in place before it will give the buyer information. On the other side, if you're selling, there's a lot of planning and strategizing as to how you're going to go about that before you might even engage with counterparties. So you can be working on something for a seller for several months before a buyer even comes over the horizon potentially.
Got you. Okay. And then presumably a big task for the lawyers is a process called due diligence. What does that involve, just for the students' benefit?
Yeah, I mean, it basically goes back to what I said earlier about assessing and managing legal risks when someone's buying a company or a business in what you're buying. If you were to sort of describe it slightly pejoratively, you could say it's kicking the tires. But actually that's a good analogy, because if you were if you're buying a second-hand car, then you have a mechanic or someone go and look over the car to make sure that it all works properly. There aren't any hidden issues. There aren't any sort of hidden problems that are then going to cost you a lot of money to fix when you're the owner of the car. And due diligence is really about that. It's about and what lawyers do in due diligence is actually only one part of an overall due diligence exercise. There's financial due diligence. There's increasingly now areas that are becoming very important, like sort of cyber security, compliance, and sort of and financial crime risks, as well as tax for an industrial business. There'll be areas like environmental. There may also be even a strategy consultant, so a management consultancy firm, and then ultimately the clients will have taken a sort of decision to commission all this work from these advisors, and what it's trying to do is to get a picture of what it's buying, both to to assess the risks, and the second part of the lawyer's job is then how to manage those risks within the framework of the transaction. But also it's often then it wants to get a picture because at the same time it's planning how it's going to run the company once it's the owner, and either how to integrate, or in the case of private equity, they very often have something that they call a 100-day plan, which does exactly what it says in the tin. They're going to go into the company when they own it, and they know they have something written down for every day from day 1 to day 100 as to what they want to accomplish. And they need to know, they obviously have great experience and expertise from other investments, but they need to know a lot about the company to be able to produce and implement successfully that plan.
Sure, thank you. Another question. I know partners don't like crystal ball gazing and are nervous about predicting the future, but if you had to predict sort of trends for 2023 in terms of M&A deals, every decade or so a different sector is sort of in vogue. It might be pharmaceuticals, it might be natural resources, etc. What are the sectors to look out for in this year, and what other predictions do you have in terms of deals and things that students should be keeping an eye on in terms of news alerts, etc.?
Sectors is an interesting question. I'm going to slightly dodge it by just looking, and a lot of this data is publicly available about what's been the most active last year, because that you have a fairly sort of good sense that will continue. I think within sort of global M&A, clearly now technology is probably the number one sort of sector in terms of the value, and it goes back to what I was talking about earlier, which is that those companies are attractive because they offer a level of a level of expertise and development that people think, actually, I can't develop that for myself on my own. I need to buy and combine to be able to do that. Other ones are probably harder to predict. I think you also, for any M&A sort of crystal ball gazer, as you put it, you're looking for sectors that may be undervalued by the market, and where sort of buyers will see opportunities to get good, as a client put it to me earlier this week, sort of good companies for reasonable prices. And you might be looking at things like the sort of an area, for example, real estate. Real estate valuations have taken a sort of big hit, particularly in the UK over the last few years, and so that may be an area that becomes more active. You look at, on the other hand, you sort of look at areas where companies have been, the earnings that companies have been generating have been increasing rapidly due to the macroeconomic factors that we've talked about, and the obvious one there is energy. Energy is a very lucrative business at the moment, so that's another potential one. And then the last one I'll sort of leave you with, and it's tied a little bit to tech, is around the financial sector, and particularly sort of in the fintech industry, where you've got a lot of companies, in the last, probably been one of the big developments in the UK, I'd say, in the last 10 years, is the number of what are called fintech companies that have been set up. And again, some of them are at different stages of development, and again, sometimes it's I talked today mostly from the perspective of the buyer, but sometimes a company itself will be looking for a partner or an outside investor, or to combine with someone, because it needs that to get to the next stage of its growth. So that's another another potential area. But it's actually quite we all sit here in January and look at these things, and I think we'll probably have a habit of being wrong most of the time, if not all of the time. So it's one of the sort of good things about being a generalist is that we find the opportunities where they are. I think if you tie yourself to a particular sector, then you risk you risk something happening in that sector and then things not being as busy as you had hoped or expected.
No, that's a real good point about being a generalist, in that you can be very agile, can't you? You can react much more quickly to market trends and pounce when the opportunity arises. Whereas if you're very fixated on one sector or a type of M&A deal, then that can be quite restrictive if that area dries up. Let's move on from talking about M&A to your role as training principal, because I'm sure the students are very keen to find out a bit more about what it would be like to train at your firm. The question I wanted to ask you is, if you had to spot a common sort of attribute or behavior that a strong trainee in your firm has displayed, what would that be? And how can future trainees sort of work towards achieving that in the way they interact with you as a firm as they're going through the hiring process?
It's a very good question. I've probably got about a decade of experience now to draw on, because we've been running trainee program for sort of, I think this year is the 10th year anniversary of when our first trainees started. So looking back over that time, I think what's, in the sort of office environment, what makes people stand out is, what I would describe as sort of intellectual and practical curiosity and a willingness and ability to get involved. That will take people a long way. And particularly when it's allied to substantive skills, analytical skills, the ability to, one of the most important things as a lawyer as you go through your career is the ability to express yourself concisely and clearly. Clients don't want memos that are pages and pages long. They want to be succinctly told what the issue is and how you're going to resolve it. So those are all, nobody comes out of university or into a training contract as fully formed. And the key the thing that also underpins this, and I think there's a good phrase that I've heard sort of from the US, is the idea that you have a growth mindset. And really that's what stands someone in the best stead over their career, because no one knows it all. No one's, you could be the most brilliant trainee ever seen, but actually that doesn't guarantee you success as an associate and beyond. So you're always growing, developing and learning whatever stage of your career you're at, and that includes when you get to my stage and beyond as well.
I like that phrase, growth mindset. I use that a lot when I'm talking to trainees in some of my training sessions. And connected to that, I guess, is that heightened self-awareness, because if you act like you know it all already, then it can really limit what you develop in the future. And one of the great attractions of being a lawyer is the fact that it is lifelong learning. Anyway, right, so moving on. There are inevitably going to be some students watching this evening who are hoping that they'll get an interview for a VAC scheme at your firm. What advice can you give to anyone who's preparing for a VAC scheme interview or hoping to get a VAC scheme interview, either with your firm or any other firms really, that will put them in good stead to convert that into an offer?
I mean, I would focus on two things. One is do your homework about the firm and have an answer to the question you will inevitably be asked, which is why are you interested in the firm and why would you see yourself working there? It's the obvious question someone will always start asking with you, and if you're not able to answer that fluently and coherently, it doesn't leave a great impression for what comes afterwards. The other thing is actually to think more about some of the factors that we've been talking about on this webcast, which is about things like how is the global situation, how does that affect lawyers, and how might that you're showing that you're sort of knowledgeable and also able to translate what's going on into into a more practical impact. I would sort of discourage people from again, there's a lot of information out there about law firms. There's a lot of opinions about what this firm does differently from the other firm. Frankly, as someone from the outside who's at the a sort of early stage of their career, it's sort of very hard for you to know whether what you're reading is correct or not. You would only be able to decide from yourself, having had exposure to the firms and what goes on inside them. So my advice there would be sort of be wary about sort of rushing to judgments or saying that you're focused on particular areas, or why is a firm doing this and not that, because actually that's, those are, ultimately your training as a lawyer is really about becoming the best lawyer that you can be and getting the best grounding that will stand you in good stead for what will hopefully be a long and successful career. So the more the more that sort of people focus on that, I think the better they'll make better and more well-informed choices, and hopefully in the long run be more successful as well.
Now, I agree with your point about being very sort of cautious about where you're gleaning information, because it is quite toxic out there at the moment, and there are lots of negative stories about the profession, which is a shame, because it can be a very fulfilling career. Talking of fulfilling careers, we sort of touched upon our ages at the beginning. You've stuck with it, and you've been at S&C since you were at NQ, is that right, or 1 year PQE?
Slightly after. It's I will be 23 years at the firm this year. I joined in 2000, which makes it easy to count.
Okay, so walk me through what's made you stay, because partners do move around, mostly driven by big paychecks. What's made you stay at S&C?
It's really been the opportunity to be part of building something for the next generation. And to put this into context, so the firm obviously has a great and storied history in the US. The firm is coming up for 150 years old at the end of this decade. There's a lot of sort of quite learned literature been written about the history of the firm, and how really it was probably one of the first truly international law firms ever in the world in the 19th and 20th century. But obviously it had sort of done that from the base of practicing US law and being based in the US. And I think over the sort of the course of the 1990s, I think was when law firms, particularly from the UK and the US, started to converge in terms of, you saw US-based law firms practicing English law. You also saw the more traditional English law firms all going to practice US law. And within that, there was also, the expansion of English law firms into Europe and other Asia and other places as well. So there was a lot going on. But when I and this will age me, when I was applying to the firm, I trained at a large English firm. Those were really the only choices available to someone who wanted to do work with any international dimension. You mentioned you used to work for the lawyer. I got the job here by answering. The lawyer was in pre-online days, was printed in hard copy. It would be delivered to law firms and to people registered on the roll, and they would sit at their desks at lunchtime and read job adverts in the back of the I answered a job advert that was it was a bit like a Carlsberg beer commercial. It said something along the lines of probably the best opportunity in London, and it didn't give the name of the firm, and you had to ring a number to find out more about it. And I rang that number, and we were at the start at that point of the English law practice was just starting, and as someone put it to me at the time, this is an opportunity to get in on the ground floor. And ever since then, I've been and to put it into perspective, we've gone from sort of 4 English qualified lawyers when I joined to now sort of well over half the office being either English qualified lawyers or training to be English qualified lawyers, to bringing on trainees, to having coverage of lots of different practice areas. And we're not we're not done yet, so we're going to carry on, and our key focus is on, and this is an area that's been really how the firm has developed, is on organic growth. So that's why I spend all this time around trainee recruitment, because bringing people in as trainees and mentoring, nurturing and developing them as lawyers, they will be the partners of the future. So
sure. Talking of bringing in trainees and mentoring them and cultivating the future generation of S&C lawyers, what can students applying to your firm for a training contract expect in terms of their 2 years with you as a trainee?
I mean, at this stage, it's a well-trodden path. In many ways, our training contract is not organised very differently to others. Pretty much everybody in the market still does you do a range of different seats. We do it slightly differently. We try and have people do 5 seats rather than 4, because that actually gives sort of slightly better opportunities, particularly when looking ahead with a view to qualification. We used to, before COVID, we had the quite nice mantra that everybody who wanted to had done an overseas seat. Obviously, COVID put pay to any ideas of sort of sending people overseas, but we are sort of right now sending people back out on overseas secondments again. We've got a great network of offices, and people really get sort of good opportunities, and well, the environment is one that's it's a relatively small office environment. People will fit in well. They'll be looked after. They'll be given real things to do. Nobody's given sort of administrative or ministerial things to do. You're involved, and you will develop at your as quickly as you show that you're able to, and that people will once you show ability and responsibility, then people people will display a lot of trust, and give you a lot of opportunities. And I really think the key difference ultimately is sort of being in that smaller environment versus, and you and I both had this as trainees, when there's 250 trainees in a firm at once, the opportunities that you may get very good opportunities, but a lot of that comes down to luck of the draw, or being sat with a person X rather than person Y as a supervisor. That there's a lot of luck in it, and you don't really realize until you're much older sort of what the role that luck played within that.
Agreed. I talked to lots of trainees who did not get their first choice seat because it's a bit of a lottery as to who you end up sitting with. And then when you're sat there, whether that person's actually going to be busy and give you decent quality work. One of the common reasons that students and indeed qualified lawyers cite when asked, why do you want to move to a US firm, or why do you want to join a US firm, is because I want lots more responsibility. Okay, which how many times have you heard that, Ben? What does that actually mean, and is it true?
I mean, I'd give an example sort of practically, and again, this is, I think a lot of the world of law and law firms is converging. So I can probably base it a bit more going back many years, well over a decade, to my own experience as an associate. But quite often we would do transactions, and quite often I'd be one of a couple of associates from our side, and then a large firm on the other side might have 5 or 6 associates, where we had 1 or 2. And probably it was sort of people like me in that generation who were spreading the idea about responsibility, was because you, as an associate, you just got to do a lot more, you got to see a lot more. You also weren't siloed. I think that's often in large firms and large organizations, their sort of business model involves giving someone a very specific role, getting them very well practiced and developed in that role so that they can do it with minimal supervision. But that was ultimately the reason why I left, was because I felt, even working in a huge law firm, that my experience was becoming very narrow and was only going to get worse. And I saw more to, my life and my career, and I'd spent too long studying and sort of working to end up down down a road of becoming, doing the same thing over and over again. I thought there was sort of more to life than that.
Yeah, no, thank you. I'm conscious that we've only got 6 minutes left. There were questions that come in. What I've done deliberately, by the way, to those students who submitted questions, is I've just incorporated them into the questions I've been asking Ben. And what I've done, which is a favour to you, is rephrase them in a way that is more appropriate when talking to partners. And in fact, with that in mind, can I just say something, Ben, if I may, just about questions we received? It's great to see so much enthusiasm, and obviously you're all trying really hard to find questions that are going to really stand out. But a couple of points from an independent person who's not recruiting for a law firm is be mindful of how you phrase your questions. Some of them came across as being a little bit confrontational. This is my observation, by the way. Some of them sounded a bit like you're trying a bit too hard. Some of you sent loads of questions when, one is enough if it's a really good question. And what you may want to think about when preparing for your interviews that hopefully will be coming up soon is how can you ask a question that's broader, that will start a nice discussion rather than one that's based on assumptions, for example, because we often get questions about what are your growth plans for the next year? How do we know the firm is planning to grow? So what about an alternative way of asking that would be, what are your plans for the office in 2023? But anyway, that's my last bit of advice. Ben, what would you like to sort of wrap up by saying? Go on.
I think, it is important, and I go back to something I said earlier, to try and be as well in terms of your preparation and how you're coming across, to be as well-rounded as possible in terms of, the way in which lawyers and law firms operate. We don't, we are a business. We operate in the broader world of business, and the more that someone can bring to the table in terms of having, thought about that, you really thought about it. Not again, we can tell when someone's just sort of picking up something that they've read on the internet, or from our website or from someone else's website. It's really taking the time to sort of think through how it works, and also show the enthusiasm and that you want to be a part of it. Those are really the two things that will help people stand out.
Thank you. And from my perspective, the key here is if your answer can be used by every other student who's applying to S&C, then it probably isn't tailored enough for what your genuine interests are. I don't want to hear any of you say to Ben in the next few weeks, I want to join S&C because it's a really prestigious firm and I'm really interested in corporate work. That's not a good answer. It needs developing. Why are you interested in corporate work? Why are you attracted by its generalist approach, etc., etc. So that's my sort of penny's worth for interview tips. Ben, it's been a real pleasure chatting to you. Thank you so much for giving up your evening to help students prepare for either interviews with your firm or to just get a general insight into the way corporate deals are managed and what role lawyers have on those. And thank you to the students who have stuck with this, and best of luck with all your applications. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.